ko'ychilarda Ümit üzme aziz xalqim Ümit üzme ey ana yurt Biz atlandık bu küreşke O yıl taştak uyuşup Allah verse bu nusretni Bizgilerimiz sep bulup Zalimlarni yığlatgudek Uğuz gibi küçlük bulup Lepildeydu asminimda Göz çaknitip şu günü Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım Ey ana makam Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to another special episode of Talk is Turkestan. I have a very special guest with me. As you've seen in the ad, I've got Mr. James Palmer, who is a deputy editor at Foreign Policy. James is the author of The Bloody White Baron, the extraordinary story of the Russian nobleman who became the last Khan of Mongolia and the death of Mao. The Tangshan Earthquake and the birth of the new China. He won the Shiva Naipaul Prize for travel writing in 2003. So he's a journalist essentially, very much familiar with the goings on of what happens in the Uyghur region. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome him to our podcast.
Aslan, thank you for having me.
Nice to have you as well. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, everything's very clear.
Excellent. So we're just going to get straight into it. I basically today wanted to touch on the journalist side of things. And basically, as we all know, China in general, but particularly the Uyghur region, as well as other regions such as southern Mongolia or Tibet, are some of the most difficult places to do journalism in the world. Now, James, could you speak to what it was or is like being a journalist in the Uyghur region?
Sure. So I should add, first of all, that I don't have a lot of experience reporting directly from Xinjiang myself. I was mostly familiar with the Uyghur diaspora in East China and elsewhere, though I've spent a little time there. And of course, I've worked with a lot of journalists who have reported from there as an editor. So, so for a long time, of course, the problems were not significantly greater than reporting from elsewhere in China because of the nature of these regions, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia as borderlands regions, as securitized regions. You were more likely to be followed or harassed by security forces, but things were not completely closed. And then since 2013, 2014, we've seen a gradual shutdown of these areas until stuff has become increasingly difficult. You're monitored virtually from the moment you enter the region as a foreigner. People you talk to are very likely to be arrested and are very aware of the limits on what's being said. I've known people who have been, in fact, Han Chinese in this case, who have been arrested by the police literally in the middle of talking to a foreigner. That's most acute in Xinjiang. It's less acute in Tibet and particularly in Inner Mongolia, but still it's much worse than it has been. And so we've come increasingly, when covering these regions, to look to other sources of information beyond direct on-the-ground reporting. One big reason, of course, being that this direct on-the-ground reporting runs severe risks for anybody we talk to. And, you have to be considerate of that. Even the action of speaking to somebody as a foreigner may be enough to get them on these networks that have sent people to the camps, sent people to prison, and so on. Even if what they say is follows the government line or is innocuous, the risk is still there. Calling people, speaking to people on WeChat, speaking to people through other communications methods can also be risky because, of course, we've seen people arrested for the act of having unapproved apps on their phone, or for using VPNs and so on. These methods that are often used to reach foreign journalists. So increasingly, we're looking at open source data, looking at the information that the Chinese state itself has put online as part of the digitization of the government. We're looking, of course, to speak to members of the diaspora and people who have managed to escape the region and made it elsewhere, and also, through the networks of information that are smuggled out through various means within the Uyghur and other communities.
Now, I understand, I saw a documentary of you, I think it was at least a year ago, where you were making an emotional plea saying that you no longer had contact with certain individuals, and most likely they had ended up in the camps, or worse, had even died. Those individuals, yeah.
I think I'm not certain that I'm not certain that they're in the camps. There are a couple of people who I think are. What I know is that they cut off contact with me because the risk of answering or the risk of being in contact was too high. And I can't say beyond that. Of course, I'm afraid that some of them have been sent to the camps or other forms of detention.
Yeah, so when China goes, simply come and visit and have a look for yourself, that's not a reality. That can't be true, can it? Even fettered access. So when we hear, or when, especially like myself, we're constantly calling for unfettered access, and were that to be granted and you were allowed in, where would you look? I mean, how would you conduct that investigation? And what do you look for, even if you were given fettered access? What are the telltale signs with something deeper is going on below the surface?
So, I mean, unfettered access basically can't exist in the Chinese system as constituted. Like it's an impossibility. You're always going to be monitored. You're always going to be guided. People, even if it's you can come and you can go anywhere. The people will be cleared out of sites. People are living in an atmosphere of fear that means they can't talk, all these kind of things. So in these kind of situations, what you're looking for, and it's a balance between, some people will try and do the things that, for instance, some journalists do in North Korea, where they try to get away from the minders and go and find people independently in the hope that somehow people will spill their hearts out to this random foreigner. I think that's a risky and often an unethical move because of the risk that you're putting people in just by being part, by making contact with them in those situations. And so what reporters are looking for are, for instance, things like demolished sites, rebuilt sites, signs of securitization, of increased police presence, of security cameras, checkpoints, armed guards, all these kind of things that indicate the level the crackdown has reached. Sometimes just the amount of securitization that the reporter faces can be a useful bit of information. Like there was a real difference between going to Xinjiang in 2007 and going to Xinjiang in 2017, for instance. And then there's you can, if you're very experienced in the region, there are other cultural signs that you can look for. Things that things that have disappeared that represent the culture. I mean, one of the very obvious signs that something very bad was happening even in the rest of China was simply the disappearance of Uyghur vendors from the streets. Like the Uyghur diaspora was once a major presence, on the streets of eastern Chinese cities, and they vanished. Like they were forced back en masse after the Kunming attack, and that was a real sign that something bad was beginning to happen. I mean, there were lots of signs before that, of course, but that was for me one of the big indicators. But you can look for the performative patriotism, like the degree to which people are forced to display symbols of the Chinese state in order to ensure that they're not singled out as being disloyal. And while that's the case throughout China to some degree, it's particularly acute for minorities, dissidents, anybody who's in a position where they might be swept up in these sort of paranoid campaigns.
Yeah, that was very good. Because there isn't that unfettered access, what we seem to be seeing is that the government is setting out these Western YouTubers on tours, enlightening the world on what is going on. It's as though if they get, I mean, I don't mean to sound crude, but if they get white people to say everything's okay, then it gives it a sort of legitimacy. How do you react to those poorly made propaganda videos made by what people refer to as white monkeys? And more broadly, could you speak to how the media works in China? That there are no independent news outlets from the, separate from the government.
Sure. So first of all, on the Western YouTubers, of course, this is a propaganda strategy going back, to the early Soviet Union, when you had figures like the Webbs, who were Western socialists who were given Potemkin tours and wrote, the Soviet Union, a new civilization, or Walter Duranty reporting from Ukraine in 1929, 1930, not certain on the date there, but so don't quote me, on where he deliberately covered up the Soviet famine, because he was ideologically in support of the communists. And now, a lot of these YouTube figures, the sad truth of it is they're not even ideologically driven. They're just utterly corrupt. They're just being paid off, which is to sell your soul because you have a craft beer business in Shenzhen, is a pretty pathetic thing, frankly. And whereas in the 1920s, in the 1920s, the Soviet Union was able to get the support of major intellectual figures because the appeal of state communism was still there. Now the best they can do is friendly Geordies. I mean, this is a big come down in many ways. And there is that kind of desire to whitewash it, as it were, the belief that if you have a white face presenting it will be more credible to foreigners. But I don't think this really has a lot of reach. I think most people who aren't, for one reason, already ideologically committed to the idea that the Chinese government is wonderful, I don't think they believe or fall for this kind of thing. It's very, it's a gross insult to Uyghur. It's a incredibly racist, nasty pieces of work, but it's not, I think, that effective. I think a lot of the propaganda within the Muslim world has been more effective. A lot of the reach out in Central Asia, Indonesia, the Middle East, and so on has been because that's backed by the governments there, because that's backed by a lot of media there, because there's an understandable narrative among some Muslims worldwide that the United States is the oppressive power rather than China, and so they don't believe, and so there's a tendency to favor China or believe China. Look at Pakistan, of course, a long-term ally, and so. I don't think that's fully effective. I think obviously that we've seen a lot of solidarity among the Muslim world, particularly at the popular level with Uyghur, but some of that propaganda has been effective. As to media in China as a whole, I think there's never been a truly independent media. There's never been that from the 1980s onwards. There have been lots of outlets that have attempted to work and journalists that have attempted to do honest reporting in China. Chinese journalists, it's media outlets that have tried to push the envelope, like Southern Weekend back in the day. But they're still ultimately vulnerable to censorship, control, able to be stomped down in a moment. And under Xi, we've seen increasingly that's moved from the old system, which was a lot of it was kind of post-facto censorship, so a lot of punishment if you went out of line, but some possibility to report or to get things out beforehand, to a much more proactive system of censorship and control, where even in nominally private outlets, a lot of what's being said is straight from the government copy. One way you can measure that is to look at the degree that newspapers use material directly from Xinhua, the official Chinese state news agency. The more Xinhua copy they're using, the more politically nervous they are, because they don't want to risk making us even a small mistake. So, and one of the other problems is that there have always been red line issues on which reporting is exceptionally dangerous, and so people avoid it or stick very closely to the government line. So traditionally, that was more concentrated on Taiwan and Tibet, and there was actually a little bit, for a while, there was a little bit more space, even, I would say, in Xinjiang. You had, Chinese papers were talking about, for instance, the fact that Uyghur people could not, or even Han people with Uyghur ID, with Xinjiang ID cards, weren't able to get hotel rooms, faced racism, and so on throughout the country. That was being discussed in the media to some degree between 2009 and 2011 in particular. But we've seen a massive hardening of that, a massive creation of a new red line around Xinjiang, and this need to constantly defend, to claim that there's no genocide, to claim that there's no atrocities, to push forward the government line. That demand on Chinese media has become far stronger. And so media outlets that want to, that don't want to be embroiled in that, tend simply to avoid talking about it altogether. But we're seeing more and more this demand from the top for positive propaganda, that people have to take part in the propaganda, have to endorse the atrocities, or the idea that no atrocities are happening. We see that not only in media, but in business, of course, with things like the cotton campaign. Oh, you've gone silent.
Sorry, I'll just get a question from one of our listeners. They've written, do you think the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, is the main driver of the current oppression?
So this is an idea that I've seen going around before, and of course it refers to the original conception of the Belt and Road before. So nowadays the Belt and Road is this kind of sprawling, all-encompassing, basically anything in China's foreign policy, foreign investment can be described as Belt and Road. It's very messy, it's not very effective. The original concept was that you had a Belt and Road which were sea and land connectivity between China and Europe, and of course Xinjiang, East Turkestan, sits directly on that route. In fact, the belt, the road, rather confusingly, the road is the sea route and the belt is the land route. And while I think that desire for resources, desire for securitization of an important route is part of it, I don't think it's the main driver. I think because the driver is this increased ethno-nationalism across the Chinese system as a result of Shiism. The reversal, which was going on even before the BRI, the reversal of the previous policy, which was the Soviet policy, at least nominally, that envisaged separate cultural and linguistic lives for minorities within the framework of a communist system, but at least nominally being able to preserve their own culture and so on, that switch towards pure assimilationism, and most of all the growing spiral of violence in that created the idea that the Uyghur, particularly young Uyghur men, were inherently a problem that had to be securitized and eliminated.
You touched on this just a moment ago. The US has been at the forefront in raising the plight of the Uyghurs. First to label it a genocide, first to sanction CCP officials. The other day you tweeted, and this is pretty much sums up a lot of China's argument against the Uyghur genocide, is that you tweeted, "I never understand the arguments that the US did the wrong thing in the past, therefore doing the right thing now would be wrong." Could you add to this? I mean, I totally agree with you, but could you just add to this and how China is using this against?
So, one of the things that we've seen actually since even the Armenian genocide is people saying, well, the United States committed genocide against Native Americans, so how can they criticize anybody else? And now it's true, the United States did commit genocide against Native Americans, and many of the things that we see in the US in the 19th century are reminiscent of conditions on the ground for Uyghur today, like Indian schools, the removal of an entire generation and the attempt to forcibly destroy the culture. But the difference is that the United States, A, doesn't do that anymore, B, broadly recognizes, though there are obviously exceptions, such as much of the Republican Party, that this was a wrong and a terrible thing that the country did, and that this allows some kind of and is horrified by the idea that these things should occur again, in the same way as the Germans, for instance, obviously committed one of the perpetrators of one of the worst genocides in the world, feel that they have some kind of mission to ensure that this doesn't happen again, when they're not trying to sell cars to China, of course. That seems to override that mission, unfortunately. But this idea, since the Armenian genocide, people have used the idea that because a country did something bad in the past, it can't criticize it today. And I'm like, well, A, this is a ridiculous idea. All countries have committed atrocities in the past. B, even if we accepted it as hypocritical, doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that this isn't actually a defense saying, well, you did a genocide now, so you did a genocide then, so we get to do a genocide now. Isn't actually a serious defense. It's whoa, there we go. My cat has been attacking the screen for the last few minutes in the background. He likes to claw it.
That's okay. It brings excitement to the podcast.
I know, it's a little drama. You get to see like the shaking behind, and there's actually a Ministry of State security agent just behind there listening. But hi, buddy. And now the dog has come over because he's jealous of the attention the cat has gotten. So, this is a when you think through it morally, logically, this is a ridiculous idea. But it's not. It's one that's very common as a defense. The Chinese argument is the sort of multi-layered thing of, we're not doing it, everything is fine, and even if we were doing it, you did it, and even if we are doing it, we're doing it for good reason. And so you'll get, because a lot of this stuff is stuff that is openly admitted by the Chinese state, the re-education camps, the placement of people in Uyghur homes, except that it's portrayed as justified out of the need to, supposedly civilize or securitize an entire people. And we can very clearly recognize this as the logic of colonialism, as the logic of imperialism. But within China, of course, this is seen as perfectly normal and acceptable. And so a lot of the information we're getting is stuff that the Chinese are putting out themselves internally, because they portray it as entirely good and righteous to, for instance, stick 1 million people in Uyghur homes.
In your mind, what do you think is the end goal for the Uyghurs? What's the end goal of Chinese government?
I think it's to destroy the Uyghur as a people. So it's not to physically annihilate them, though of course the campaign has no doubt come with many deaths, from torture, from brutality, from sickness or deprivation. A lot of elderly people have been put in the camps in bad conditions. But I don't think that physical annihilation is the chief purpose. I think they basically want to lock away or coerce an entire generation that they see as fundamentally poisoned against Chinese rule, to indoctrinate to the next generation, and possibly to even split up the people physically, so that the sense of a coherent community is destroyed. Certainly to destroy the idea of any kind of inheritance or culture or history. That's why we've seen, for instance, people who were part of the party state, people who were involved in writing textbooks for the Chinese state in the 2000s, being condemned by the Chinese state, claiming that these were, two-faced people who were actually creating separatist textbooks all along for what was simply the portrayal of a Uyghur existence and a Uyghur culture in the past. And so I think the end goal is to destroy that culture, to destroy the sense of the Uyghur as a people, and to force assimilation on a broad scale. It's the same dream, the same vision that colonialist countries have had in a lot of cases. Think of, again, going to the US, the 19th century idea of, kill the Indian and save the man. It's the same idea when it comes to the up and coming generation. I think for the current generation, they recognize that that's an impossibility, and so it's simply the imposition of a climate of total fear that breaks up the culture, prevents any, as they say, it, security risk, and destroys the civil society foundations of Uyghur life.
Okay, solution-wise, what do you think is going to work? Because we've got, countries and parliaments labeling it a genocide, economic sanctions on certain individuals, the main perpetrators, so to speak, not doing much. What do you think would be something that, and we're even awarding them with a Winter Olympics next year, sending the message that it's okay to oppress people and you're still going to be able to host these humanely events. How are we going to solve this?
So I think we have to be realistic about what the immediate goal is, and I would say the immediate goal is to get the Chinese government to back off the worst of the crackdown. They're obviously not going to allow many more Uyghur to leave. I think that's going to be unfortunately key. I don't see there being a realistic prospect of any kind of independence or increased autonomy for Uyghur life in the Uyghur homeland. But I think we can get it to something like the 1970s with Jews in the Soviet Union, when the Jackson-Vanik Amendment basically enabled, put pressure and incentives on the Soviet Union to allow large numbers of Jews out to emigrate to Israel or the United States in return for the lifting of trade sanctions and similar methods. So I think this is probably only realistically doable when Xi is ousted or dies, because when Xi Jinping is ousted or dies, because I think the system has committed itself too deeply. I think that there's actually a lot of people within the system who think that things have gone too far, who realize the dangers of the extreme route that they've gone down. Not some of them out of moral reasons, some of them because they're genuinely horrified, some of them out of simple pragmatic reasons, seeing the PR disaster that this has created for China worldwide. But I think that they will only have the space to act once Xi goes, and who knows when that will be. But once that happens, I think that there will be some ability to back off, in the same way as the Chinese state has backed off previous atrocities like the Cultural Revolution or the Maoist era as a whole, to issue there may even be the possibility for limited apologies and recompense to some of the people affected, though that may be a stretch. And certainly there'll be the possibility of loosening things up in a way that allows people out, allows the diaspora to reunite with their families. I think that that's an achievable goal. Like, I think it's doable. It's going to be very tough, but I think that should be the end state, right? Oh, the end state for now that we're looking towards when we try and put pressure on China.
Well, thank you so much for your insights today, James. Make sure, guys, you can follow James on @BeijingPalmer on Twitter, and also follow @Foreign Policy. He's the deputy director there. Are there any final words you'd like to share with us before I let you go, James?
Just again to, as always, try and express my solidarity with the community. It's one that's become very dear to me over the past few years, and where I'm always very touched by people's generosity, by their bravery, and by their endurance and solidarity.
Thank you so much. I do want to say goodbye to you off screen as well, so I'm going to close out the show. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much to all the listeners. Make sure you guys share, like, and subscribe to our channel, and get it out there. And until next time, everybody, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ümit üzme aziz halkım, ümit üzme ey ana yurt. Biz atlandık bu güreşke, o yıl taştek uyuşup. Allah verse bu nusretni, bizgilerimiz sep-sep bulur.